If your last name is on this list, your ancestor didn't just live in Bohemia. They fought for it, in the most radical religious revolution in the history of medieval Europe. In a series of wars that began in 1419 with the defenestration of 7 Catholic officials from a Prague town hall window and did not end until 1436, when the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy together acknowledged that the Bohemian heretics had won and that the Czech people would worship on their own terms. These 10 surnames carry the fingerprints of the Hussite world. They appear in the military rolls of the Hussite armies that defeated 5 separate crusades launched against them by the combined military power of the Holy Roman Empire, the papacy, and the Catholic kingdoms of Central Europe. They appear in the chronicles of Jan Žižka, the one-eyed, then blind, then dead general who never lost a battle and whose military innovations changed the nature of warfare in Europe permanently. They appear in the theological documents of the Hussite reform movement that demanded communion in both kinds for the laity, bread and wine, not just bread, a demand so apparently simple and so profoundly threatening to the Catholic sacramental order that the entire power of medieval Christendom was assembled to suppress it, and failed. Most of the families who carry these names today, in the Czech Republic, in Slovakia, in the Czech diaspora across America and the wider world, have no idea that their surname is a direct connection to the most militarily successful religious reform movement in the history of medieval Europe. The movement that anticipated the Protestant Reformation by a full century. That proved that a determined people with a coherent ideology and an innovative military commander could defeat the organized military power of an entire continent. And that left in the Czech national character a stubbornness, a suspicion of external authority, and a commitment to intellectual honesty that is still there today. Stay until number 1, because that surname belongs to the bloodline of the man who commanded the Hussite armies, who was blinded in one eye by an arrow at the siege of Robbie in 1421 and continued fighting, who lost the sight in his other eye at the siege of Přibyslavice in 1422 and continued fighting, who led the Hussite armies to victory after victory as a completely blind commander until his death from plague in 1424, and who, in the 3 years of total blindness, never lost a battle. Number 10. Novak. The next surname is the most common Czech surname in the Czech Republic and in the Czech diaspora worldwide. So common that it has become the Czech equivalent of Smith or Jones, the default surname, the name you reach for when you need a representative Czech person, the name that appears more frequently in Czech phone directories than any other. But pull it back to its Czech origin and you find not ordinariness at all, but the record of a specific social moment in Czech history, the moment of arrival, of settlement, of the new person who came to the community and became part of it. From the Czech novi, meaning new, and the suffix ak, indicating a person characterized by that quality. The new one, the newcomer, the person who has just arrived. Not new in the sense of young or inexperienced, but new in the specific medieval sense of a person newly arrived in a community, a settler, a migrant, a person who had come from somewhere else and was establishing themselves in a new place. In the context of the Hussite period, the newcomer had a specific resonance. The Hussite Wars created enormous population movement across Bohemia and Moravia, people fleeing the crusading armies, people being expelled from towns that had changed religious allegiance, people following the Hussite armies as they moved through the Bohemian landscape, people resettling in communities that had been depopulated by war and plague. The Novak families were the people of this movement, the ones who arrived somewhere new, established themselves, and were identified permanently by the fact of their arrival. Jan Hus himself, the Czech theologian and university rector, whose burning at the Council of Constance in 1415 that triggered the Hussite Wars, was a kind of newcomer in the most profound sense. He brought ideas to Bohemia that had their origin in the writings of the English theologian John Wycliffe. Ideas about the authority of Scripture over tradition, the corruption of the clergy, the right of the laity to receive communion in both kinds, and planted them in Czech soil so thoroughly that they grew into a revolution that outlasted him by 2 decades and changed the religious map of Europe permanently. If your name is Novak, your bloodline is the newcomer tradition of Czech history, the arrival, the settlement, the person who came somewhere new and became the community, the most common Czech name. Because the most common Czech experience, across 1,000 years of migration and war and displacement and resettlement, was the experience of arriving somewhere new. Number 9. Dvořák. Number 9 carries the name that most of the world knows not as a Czech surname, but as the name of the composer, the Czech national composer. The man who sat in Iowa in 1893 and wrote the New World Symphony, the symphony that created, in the homesick imagination of a Czech composer in the American Midwest, what American music should sound like. But the name itself is older than the composer, older than the music, older than the national consciousness that the music helped to create. From the Czech dvůr, meaning court or manor farm, and the suffix ak, indicating a person associated with that place. The court person, the manor man, the one who lives at or works at the Lord's court or the manor farm, the dvůr that was the center of the Czech agricultural estate system from the medieval period onward. In the Hussite period, the dvůr was a significant social institution. The manor farms of the Czech nobility were the economic basis of the military system, the noble estates that produced the surplus that funded the cavalry and the equipment of the Hussite armies. The Hussite movement drew support from every level of Czech society, from the Czech nobility, who saw in it a challenge to German and imperial domination of Bohemian institutions, through the Czech urban middle class, who were the primary constituency of the radical Hussite movements in Prague and the other Bohemian cities, to the Czech peasantry, who saw in the Hussite challenge to the Church's authority a challenge to the entire structure of feudal obligation. Antonin Dvořák, born in 1841 in the village of Nehlahozeves in Bohemia, the son of a butcher and innkeeper, became the most internationally celebrated Czech composer of the 19th century. His New World Symphony, premiered in Carnegie Hall in December 1893, incorporated elements of African American spiritual music and Native American musical tradition that Dvořák had encountered during his time as director of the National Conservatory of Music in New York, arguing that American composers should build their national music on the indigenous musical traditions of their own continent rather than importing European forms. The suggestion was controversial. It is still controversial. But the symphony, particularly its second movement, the Largo, whose melody was subsequently fitted with words to become the spiritual Going Home, became one of the most performed symphonies in the international concert repertoire. The Courtman from Bohemia, in Iowa, telling America what its music should sound like. From a Czech manor farm. If your name is Dvořák, your bloodline comes from the court, the manor farm that was the center of the Czech agricultural world, the name that a composer carried to the American Midwest and gave to the sound of a new world while remembering the old one. Number 8. Procházka. Number 8 carries a name that is, in its Czech origin, one of the most perfectly descriptive names in the European surname record. A name that describes not a place, not an occupation, not a physical characteristic, but an activity, the walk, the stroll, the act of walking through the world in a particular way, observant, unhurried, noticing what is there to be noticed. From the Czech procházka, meaning a walk, a stroll, or a promenade, from procházet, to walk through, to stroll. The walking one, the stroller, the person who walks. A name from the Czech naming tradition that fixed a characteristic activity as a permanent family identifier, the family of the walkers, the descendants of the person who was known for walking, for moving through the world on foot, for the specifically Czech pedestrian relationship to the landscape. In the Hussite military tradition, the walker had a very specific significance. The Hussite armies were fundamentally infantry armies. The military innovation of Jan Žižka that made the Hussite forces so devastating was the Wagenburg, the war wagon formation. Chains of armored farm wagons arranged in a defensive circle or line, from which Hussite crossbowmen and handgunners fired at the attacking cavalry of the crusading armies. The Wagenburg made infantry firepower decisive against mounted knights in a way that transformed the tactical calculus of Central European warfare. It was the walker's answer to the rider's traditional military supremacy. The Hussite foot soldier who served in the Wagenburg, who marched alongside the wagons, who fought from behind the wagon walls and then advanced when the cavalry had been broken by fire, was the tactical center of the most successful military innovation in 15th century Europe. He walked. He was the Procházka of the Czech military revolution, the one who moved through the world on foot and found, in that pedestrian movement, a form of military power that the mounted knight could not answer. If your name is Procházka, your bloodline walks. The stroller who saw the world at walking pace. The foot soldier of the Hussite Revolution, who found that walking behind a wagon wall with a crossbow was more effective than riding in the open with a lance. Still walking, still noticing, still Procházka. Number 7. Kovář. Number 7 carries the name of the craft that, in the Hussite military world, was as important as any general and more important than most cavalry. The blacksmith. The man whose work produced the weapons, the wagon fittings, the chain links, the handguns, the crossbow mechanisms, and the agricultural tools converted to military use that made the Hussite Wagenburg the most formidable defensive military system in 15th century Europe. From the Czech kovář, meaning blacksmith, from kovat, to forge or to hammer. The blacksmith, the forger, the one who works iron, a name from the Czech craft tradition that carries in its single word the entire material basis of the Hussite military revolution. The Wagenburg was not simply a circle of wagons. It was a sophisticated military system whose effectiveness depended on precise ironwork. The chains that connected the wagons and prevented cavalry from riding between them were iron. The hooks that locked the wagon wheels were iron. The crossbow mechanisms that armed the defenders were iron. The handguns that the Hussite armies were among the first in Europe to use systematically in field warfare were iron. The flails, the war hammers, the pikes, the agricultural tools converted to military weapons that the Czech peasant fighters carried, all iron. Jan Žižka understood, in a way that few commanders of his era did, that military effectiveness was ultimately a logistics problem. You could have the finest tactical doctrine in the world, but if your weapons were poorly made, your chains broke at the wrong moment, your crossbow mechanisms jammed in the rain, your wagons came apart under cavalry attack, the doctrine was worthless. The Czech blacksmiths who supplied the Hussite armies were as essential to the victories at Vítkov Hill in 1420, at Kutná Hora in 1421 to 1422, at Německý Brod in 1422, as the generals who commanded on the field. If your name is Kovář, your bloodline forged the iron of the Hussite Revolution, the weapons that defeated 5 crusades, the chains that held the wagons together when the cavalry of the Holy Roman Empire charged. Still forging, still holding, still Kovář. Before we continue, if you're finding this useful, subscribe to Bloodline Decoded Every week we uncover the history hidden inside names that people carry without knowing what they mean. Hit subscribe and the next video will already be waiting for you. Number 6. Havel. Number 6 carries the name of a Czech saint, a Czech dissident, a Czech president, and a Czech playwright who became the conscience of his nation in the darkest period of the 20th century Czech experience, and who then became its leader when the darkness lifted. A name that connects the medieval Hussite tradition of resistance to spiritual and political authority with the 20th century Czech tradition of resistance to communist authority in a single unbroken thread of national stubbornness. From the Czech form of the Latin Gallus, meaning rooster or gall, carried into Czech through the cult of Saint Gallus, the Irish-Scottish missionary who evangelized Switzerland in the 7th century and whose cult spread through Central Europe in the medieval period. A name from the Catholic devotional tradition of medieval Bohemia that became, through the career of one extraordinary man, the name most associated with Czech moral courage in the 20th century. Václav Havel, the Czech playwright, dissident, and first president of the Czech Republic, was born in Prague in 1936, the son of a film studio owner whose property was confiscated by the communist regime that took power in 1948. He was denied access to university education because of his bourgeois origins. He worked as a stagehand at the ABC Theater in Prague and educated himself in philosophy and literature in the margins of the regime that had excluded him from formal education. His plays, The Garden Party, The Memorandum, The Increased Difficulty of Concentration, were performed in the theater on the balustrade in Prague in the 1960s during the brief liberalization of the Prague Spring and made him the most celebrated Czech playwright of his generation. When the Soviet invasion of 1968 crushed the Prague Spring and normalized the Czechoslovak communist regime, Havel was banned from the theater. His plays were removed from Czech stages. He was denied a passport. He continued writing. He signed Charter 77, the human rights document that made the Czech dissident movement visible to the world and made Havel its most prominent figure. He was imprisoned 3 times between 1977 and 1989. He served his longest sentence, nearly 4 years, between 1979 and 1983. He was released and continued writing. He could not be silenced. When the Velvet Revolution of November 1989 swept away the communist regime in 17 days of peaceful protest, the crowds in Wenceslas Square chanted Havel na hrad, Havel to the castle. To the Prague castle that had been the seat of Czech royal and presidential power for 1,000 years. He was elected president of Czechoslovakia in December 1989 by the Federal Assembly, in the same building where he had been interrogated by the secret police. The Hussite tradition and the Havel tradition are the same tradition. The tradition of saying no to the power that claims authority over your conscience, of refusing to pretend that what is false is true, of paying the personal price of that refusal and continuing anyway. Jan Hus said it in 1415 at the Council of Constance, when he was told to recant and refused and burned. Václav Havel said it in 1979, in a prison cell, writing plays that could not be performed. Same tradition, 5.5 centuries apart, still Czech. If your name is Havel, your bloodline carries the rooster's call, the one who announces the dawn, whether or not the dawn is welcome. Still calling, still Czech, still on the castle. Number 5. Tabor/Taborski. Number 5 carries a name that is not simply a surname, but the name of a city that the Hussite movement founded in 1420 as a deliberate act of religious and political separation from the existing order. A city whose name comes from the biblical Mount Tabor, where the transfiguration of Christ occurred. A city that was intended, by the people who built it, to be the New Jerusalem, the community of the righteous, the city of God, the place where the radical Hussite vision of a community without private property, without class distinction, without the corruption of the Catholic Church, without the domination of the German imperial system, would be made real on Czech soil. From the Czech Tábor, the city in southern Bohemia founded by the radical Hussite movement in 1420, itself from the biblical Tabor, the mountain of the Transfiguration, the Taborite, the one from Tabor, the family of the radical Hussite community, a name that carries in its 2 syllables the entire theology and the entire social program of the most radical wing of the Czech religious revolution. The Taborites, the Tabori, the people of Tabor, were the radical wing of the Hussite movement, as distinct from the more moderate Utrechists, who simply wanted communion in both kinds and a Czech national church. The Taborites wanted the end of the Catholic sacramental system, the end of monastic institutions, the end of purgatory as a theological concept, the end of private property in their own community, and the establishment of a godly social order that they found described in the Bible and that the existing Catholic social order systematically denied. They believed in the imminent return of Christ. In the 1420s, they believed it was happening now, that the end times were upon them, that the Crusades launched against them were the final battle between the forces of God and the forces of the Antichrist being, in their theology, not a distant supernatural figure but the papacy itself, represented most immediately by the crusading armies burning Bohemian villages in the name of defending the Catholic Church. Prokop the Great, Prokop Holy, Prokop the Bald, was the greatest Taborite military commander after Žižka's death. He led the Hussite armies in the great counter-offensive campaigns of the late 1420s and 1430s, launching raids into Austria, Hungary, Saxony, Brandenburg, and Silesia that carried Czech military power deep into the surrounding territories and demonstrated that the Hussite armies were not simply capable of defending Bohemia, but of offensive operations across Central Europe. He died at the Battle of Lipany in 1434, when the moderate Utrechists allied with the Catholic forces and destroyed the Taborite army in the internal conflict that ended the most radical phase of the Hussite movement. If your name is Tabor or Taborski, your bloodline built the New Jerusalem in southern Bohemia and fought the Crusades of half of Europe with the conviction that God was on their side, and won the Crusades, and lost the internal battle, and left a city that is still there, still named Tabor, still carrying the name of the mountain of the Transfiguration in its Czech streets. Number 4. Hus/Husak. Number 4 carries the name of the man himself, the theologian whose burning at the Council of Constance on July 6, 1415 triggered the revolution, who had been guaranteed safe conduct to the council by the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund and was burned anyway, who refused to recant the ideas he believed were true, who died by all accounts with extraordinary composure, praying as the flames rose around him, and whose death turned a theological reform movement into a national liberation struggle. From the Czech Hus, meaning goose. The goose. John Hus himself joked about the connection. His name meant goose, and he reportedly said at Constance that even if they burned him, a swan would come after him that they would not be able to burn. A prophecy that Czech tradition applied to Martin Luther, who came a century later and completed the Reformation that Hus had begun. The goose became the swan. The burning became the Reformation. Jan Hus was born around 1369 in the village of Husinec in southern Bohemia, the son of a peasant family. He studied at the University of Prague, became a popular preacher at the Bethlehem Chapel, and was deeply influenced by the writings of John Wycliffe, the English theologian whose condemnation of papal authority and whose argument for Scripture as the sole basis of Christian authority provided the intellectual framework for the Hussite reform movement. He preached at the Bethlehem Chapel in Czech, not in Latin, the language of the Church, but in Czech, the language of his congregation. He argued for the chalice, communion in both kinds, for the laity. He criticized the wealth and corruption of the clergy. He was excommunicated. He was ordered to stop preaching. He continued. He was summoned to the Council of Constance in 1414 with a guarantee of safe conduct from Emperor Sigismund. He went. He was arrested on arrival. He was tried for heresy. He was offered the opportunity to recant. He refused, on the grounds that he could not recant ideas he believed were true and that had not been disproved by Scripture. He was burned on July 6, 1415. His ashes were thrown into the Rhine so that no relics remained for his supporters to venerate. His supporters in Bohemia did not need relics. They had his example. They threw the Catholic officials out of the Prague town hall window in 1419, the first defenestration of Prague, the beginning of the Hussite Wars, and fought the Crusades launched against them for 17 years. They won. If your name is Hus, or Husak, your bloodline is the goose that became a swan, the man who refused to say that what he believed was false, who burned at Constance in 1415, and whose burning was the fire that lit a revolution. Still the goose, still the swan, still burning in the right places. Number 3. Žižka, Žižkov. Number 3 carries the name of the most extraordinary military commander in Czech history and one of the most extraordinary military commanders in European history. The man who lost an eye and continued fighting, who lost both eyes and continued fighting, who died and continued winning, because after his death from plague in 1424, his soldiers named themselves the orphans, the children of Žižka, and continued fighting in his name under his tactical system for another decade. From the Czech Žižka, a diminutive of uncertain origin, possibly from žit, to live, or from a place name, or from a personal characteristic. A name of specifically Czech character that became, in the career of the man who bore it, the most feared military name in 15th century Central Europe, Jan Žižka z Trocnova. Jan Žižka z Trocnova was born around 1360 in the village of Trocnov in southern Bohemia. He served as a mercenary in the Polish-Lithuanian army at the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, where the combined Polish-Lithuanian-Czech Tatar force destroyed the Teutonic Knights in the largest battle of medieval European history, a battle that Žižka would have experienced at close range, absorbing lessons about the management of large mixed forces in complex terrain that he would apply in the very different tactical context of the Hussite Wars. He was already blind in one eye when the Hussite Wars began in 1419. He commanded the first Hussite victory at the Battle of Vítkov Hill in July 1420, where his forces, heavily outnumbered, defeated the first crusade launched against Bohemia. He developed and systematized the Wagenburg, the war wagon formation, as the primary tactical system of the Hussite armies, combining the defensive firepower of crossbows and handguns with the mobility that could place the wagons on advantageous ground before the enemy could respond. He lost the sight in his remaining eye at the siege of Pribysław in 1421. He was now completely blind. He continued commanding. He continued winning. The Hussite armies under his blind command won battles at Kutná Hora in 1421 to 1422, at Německý Brod in 1422, and at numerous smaller engagements. He planned the battles through detailed reconnaissance reports from officers he trusted. He coordinated the Wagenburg positions by sound and by touch. He navigated the battlefield by the information his commanders brought him. He never lost. He died of plague in October 1424, besieging the castle of Pribysław. He reportedly asked to be skinned after his death, so that his skin could be used to make a drum that would lead his soldiers into battle even after he was gone. Whether this request was granted or not is disputed. What is not disputed is that his soldiers named themselves the Orphans after his death and continued fighting in his name for another decade. If your name is Zizka, your bloodline is the blind commander who never lost, the man who asked to have his skin made into a drum, the orphans who fought in his name after he was gone, still fighting, still hearing the drum. Number 2, Prokopov. Number 2 belongs to the name of the commander who took the Hussite armies beyond the defense of Bohemia and into the offensive operations that carried Czech military power across Central Europe. The Taborite leader who demonstrated that the Wagenburg system was not merely a defensive formation, but could be used as the basis of offensive campaigns across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. The man who launched the Spanile Zizdi, the beautiful rides, the great Hussite raiding expeditions into the surrounding territories. That made the Hussite armies the most feared military force in early 15th century Europe. From the Czech form of the Greek Prokopios, meaning successful in war, or one who advances in battle. The one who advances, the one who makes progress in war. A name from the Greek martyrological tradition that entered Czech through the cult of Saint Prokop, the Czech hermit and abbot who founded the Sazava monastery in the 11th century and who was the most important Czech saint after Václav. A name of sacred association that became the name of the most aggressive Hussite military commander. Prokop the Great, Prokop Holy, Prokop the Bald, so called for his bare-shaved monastic tonsure that he retained even as a military commander, was not a soldier by training, but a priest. He had been ordained and had studied theology before the Hussite Wars began. When Jan Žižka died in 1424, Prokop became the most capable Hussite military commander available and was recognized as such by the Taborite community. He led the great Spanile Zizdi of the late 1420s and early 1430s, Hussite expeditions that ranged across Saxony, Brandenburg, Silesia, Austria, and Hungary, burning and plundering and demonstrating to the rulers of Central Europe that Bohemia was not a problem to be solved by crusade, but a power to be negotiated with. The expeditions terrorized the surrounding territories so effectively that German populations in the regions the Hussites raided remembered them for generations as the Great Fear, the terrible force that descended from Bohemia with their wagons and their firepower and their Czech hymns. He died at the Battle of Lipany in May 1434, when the moderate Utraquists allied with Catholic forces and attacked the Taborite army. The Wagenburg was broken from within by treachery as much as by force. Prokop the Great was killed on the field. The radical Hussite movement that he had led was broken. The Council of Basel negotiations that followed eventually produced the Compactata, the agreement by which the Hussite Utraquists were recognized as a legitimate Catholic practice, the first time a heretical movement had negotiated its way to legal recognition within Catholicism. If your name is Prokop or Prokopov, your bloodline advanced into battle when the Holy Roman Empire said that no one could advance against them. The priest who became a general, the beautiful rides into the heart of the enemy's territory. The battle that was lost from within, still advancing, still Prokop. Number 1, Pojebrady, Jerzy Zid Pojebrat. And now number 1. This surname belongs to the dynasty that produced the only Hussite king. The only man in the history of medieval Europe who rose from the Hussite reform movement to the throne of a major European kingdom and held it against the combined opposition of the papacy, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Catholic kingdoms of Central Europe for over a decade. The king, who called himself the King of Two Peoples, the Catholics and the Utraquists, and who spent his reign trying to hold them together in a single kingdom without sacrificing the religious freedom that the Hussite Wars had won. From the Czech Poděbrady, a town in Bohemia on the Elbe River, east of Prague, whose name the family took as their territorial identifier in the Czech noble tradition. The family of Poděbrady, the lords of the town on the Elbe, a name from the Czech noble landscape that became the name of the Hussite king. Jiří z Poděbrad, George of Poděbrady, king of Bohemia from 1458 to 1471, was born in 1420, the year the First Crusade was launched against the Hussite movement. He grew up in the Hussite world, was educated in the Utraquist tradition, and rose through the Bohemian noble class to become the regent of Bohemia in 1452 and king in 1458. His election as king by the Bohemian Diet made him the first elected king in Czech history, chosen by the nobility of Bohemia rather than succeeding by inheritance, and the only Hussite king in the history of medieval Europe. His reign was defined by the attempt to hold together a kingdom divided between Utraquist and Catholic communities, to defend the religious freedoms that the Compactata had guaranteed, and to resist the pressure of Pope Pius II, who declared the Compactata invalid and called for a new crusade against Bohemia in 1462. The king, who had hoped to be the peacemaker between the religious traditions of his kingdom, found himself excommunicated in 1466, with a crusade being organized against him by his Catholic neighbors. He responded with one of the most remarkable diplomatic initiatives of the 15th century. In 1462 and 1463, he proposed the creation of a League of Christian Princes, an international organization of European rulers that would maintain peace between Christian nations, establish a system of arbitration for disputes between member states, and provide collective security against the Ottoman threat. The proposal anticipated, by 5 centuries, the fundamental principles of the League of Nations and the United Nations. No one was ready for it in 1462. The proposal was ignored by every major European ruler. He died in 1471, excommunicated, his kingdom under military pressure from the Catholic powers, his proposed League of Christian Princes unrealized. He was buried in the Church of the Holy Spirit in Poděbrady, the town whose name he carried, the town on the Elbe whose family had produced the only Hussite king. Genetic research on the Bohemian noble tradition has not specifically isolated the Poděbrady lineage, but the broader genetic record of the Czech population shows the characteristic Central European mix of Slavic, Germanic, and Celtic genetic streams that records the deep history of the Bohemian crossroads, the territory at the center of Europe where East and West, North and South, have been meeting, trading, marrying, fighting, and intermingling for 3,000 years. The Czech people are not descended from the Hussites alone. They are the accumulated consequence of everything that has ever moved through the heart of Europe. But the Hussite tradition, the tradition of saying no to the authority that claims power over your conscience, of paying the price of that refusal, of fighting 5 crusades and winning, of producing a blind general who never lost a battle, and a king who proposed the United Nations 500 years before anyone was ready to build it. That tradition is specifically and inalienably Czech. It is in the national character. It is in the stubbornness. It is in the refusal to pretend that what is false is true. Not mythology, chronicle, battle record, theological treatise, the Compactata, the charter of the proposed League of Christian Princes, the church in Poděbrady where the king was buried, confirmed in the national character of a people who have been burned, invaded, partitioned, occupied, and suppressed by every major power in European history, and who are still here, still Czech, still refusing. 10 surnames, 10 families, 10 corridors leading back through the Wagenburg formations, moving across the Bohemian landscape with the Hussite hymn Ktoś su boshi bojownicy, you who are warriors of God, sung by the soldiers as they went into battle, through the blind Žižka, planning his victories by touch and by sound in the years after 1422, through Prokop's beautiful rides into the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, demonstrating that the Bohemians would not be contained, through Jan Hus burning at Constance in 1415 because he would not say that what he believed was false, through George of Podjebrady proposing the United Nations to rulers who were not ready for it, through the Velvet Revolution of 1989 when Havel was carried from prison to the Prague Castle in 17 days of peaceful protest. Your name is not just Czech. It is a Wagenburg. It is the chains that hold the wagons together. It is the handgun fired from behind the wagon wall at the crusading cavalry of the Holy Roman Empire. It is the refusal, Hus at Constance, Žižka on the battlefield without eyes, Havel in the prison cell, to say that what is true is false, because someone powerful wants you to. Drop your surname in the comments. Tell me if your family carried a Czech name through the Habsburg centuries, through the brief democracy of the First Republic, through the Nazi occupation, through the Communist period, through 1968 and the Soviet invasion, through 1989 and the Velvet Revolution. Tell me if you knew what your name once fought for, because those stories are the continuation of everything on this list. If you made it to the end of this video, subscribe to Origins Decoded. Every week, another name, another bloodline, another history that nobody told you was yours.